You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast. I'm Mason Pasha. Over the last 18 months, I've been co-hosting episodes with my friend, Jason Cummins, to better understand the landscape of Indigenous education leadership and the nuances of a culturally responsive classroom. Today, we're continuing on this journey with a great guest, Kelly Berry, who we'll hear more about in a second. Jason, good to see you. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Uh, Good to see you this week, Mason. I'm Jason Cummins from South Central, the region of South Central Montana, Northern Wyoming. That's our territory, our ancestral homelands. Really happy to have our guest here with us today. This is really forward thinking, got some great things to add to the conversation, and a lot of food for thought for our K 12 administrators.
Amazing. Kelly, would you mind giving us a little introduction? Who are you? Where are you? All that.
Sure. I'm excited to be here and thanks for the invitation.
Of course.
My name is Kelly Berry. I'm a citizen of the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma with Kiowa and Choctaw relations. I'm from Southwest Oklahoma, where there's about seven tribes that are located within about 60 miles of each other. So we all know each other. We all participate in ceremonies and dances together. So right now I am a postdoc fellow / lecturer at the University of Oklahoma, where I teach in the Native American Studies department. I'm also a certified high school social studies teacher and a certified high school principal.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing.
And one thing I've noticed with a lot of our interviews is a lot of Indigenous scholars will share their background and positionality. Why do you think that is?
For me, I've learned this going through my doctoral studies. It seems like when I mention my background or my subjectivity, it always gives more credibility within the audience. They know that I'm coming from a position where I know what I'm talking about, or if it's a K through 12 issue, because I've taught in a K through 12 system. If it's a BIE issue, it's because I've taught in a BIE Indian boarding school. So it lends credibility to who I am, especially coming from an Indigenous lens. So that's my positionality. I have this background and know what I'm talking about. If it's coming from such as an Indian boarding school issue, then I've been there and experienced it. Whereas a lot of people, they talk about it, but they've never experienced teaching in a boarding school. So that's where my positionality comes in play.
Yeah, I always appreciate hearing somebody's positionality because rather than assuming to come from a positivist view where we pretend we're neutral, it's like, okay, here's my lens. This is how I view these issues. And that lends some credibility. And also to find out where someone is in community, like, okay, how are we connected? Where's the degrees of separation? And academically, I think you belong to Cornell and Alex's academic family too. And so we've had Dr. Redcorn on and
Yeah.
Go back and listen to that episode.
Dr. Redcorn and Dr. Pee Wee Wardy taught me the ropes going through academia. They put me in a position where I'm at right now. And I've met a lot of mentors and friends along the roads. It's been a very exciting journey, not just to K through 12, but higher ed, and learn the nuances of what higher ed is, the setbacks, the obstacles, the barriers, the wins we have. So I appreciate Jason's mentorship through the way.
I was reading a book recently. I think it's Pollution as Colonialism, I think is what it was called. Really, a really interesting book. And the form of it was very engaged with how you honor intellectual and cultural ancestors as you're writing. A lot of the footnotes were very casual, but there'd be something about like where they heard this thing from, and they'd name drop like 20 people from their tribe who helped them see this. The way that you were talking about Dr. Redcorn right then, like how does reference or citation exist within Indigenous scholarship or leadership? Like, is it a different approach to citation and bringing along this kind of legacy of references and histories, or is it kind of mapped now onto our more Western conception of bibliographies, annotations, that kind of thing?
For the most part, it is mapped in Western thinking, but what I've been taught by Dr. Redcorn and Dr. Pee Wee Wardy is the use of oral stories. For my teachings in my classrooms from K through 12 to higher ed, I always bring in an oral story that's not written down in the textbooks. And my students are not familiar with that way because they're straightforward textbooks. That's all they've known growing up. So when I bring in an oral story from the 1800s that was passed down from my ancestors, my relatives, It really gives an idea about the value of oral stories. You can cite oral stories, and I know sometimes my colleagues in Western thought will tell me oral stories don't really mean a lot. Yeah, they do to our culture. Just because they're not relevant to what you're citing doesn't mean I'm not going to cite it. I've had pushback from oral stories being cited, but when it gets down to it, I'm going to cite it no matter what, because that's our way of citing stories that are not written down. That's how I see it.
Hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's very insightful. Acknowledging your sources is big in the community as well. Acknowledging where you heard the story, who told it, and showing that unbroken chain of the sources. And adding to that is just the accountability piece, relational accountability.
Hmm.
Whereas in a Western academy, there's a free market society, but in the Indigenous scholarship community, those practicing relational accountability will seek out permission first.
Hmm.
Be sure to acknowledge where they heard it. And so it's a bit different, a little more accountability to your relationships.
That's interesting.
If I went by the textbooks, then my students would never know these stories that have been handed down for generations. They would never know those oral stories of Indian boarding schools, because as a certified high school teacher, and Jason knows this, not much is covered in the textbooks because you got to hit every standard throughout the year. You're only spending like half a day on a topic. So if I can bring in more about the indigenous ways of knowing, then that's going to give my students a more insightful view of indigenous peoples throughout the century. So that's why I do it. It may buck the trend of going by the textbook non-native colleagues do, but I don't follow the game plan. I want to be my own indigenous teacher in the classroom.
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Jason, I may take this into the future real quick and then come back, because that's an interesting jumping off point for Indigenous Futurism, which, Kelly, is something I read about in your bio and some of the other things that you've published and written. Obviously, futurism, don't really have a textbook for it. Hasn't happened yet. How are you thinking about, I guess, what is Indigenous Futurism, and how does it relate to something like a futurist thinking or an Afrofuturism? And then how does this show up in your practice and with your students?
Yeah. So for me, I read the articles on indigenous futurisms, but for me, it's about reclaiming the narrative and maybe an alternative timeline. If you go back to what we people call first contact.
Kelly, you may ask the question again, or are you good?
No, I'm good.
Great. Take it away.
Sure. I've spoken about this at many presentations, so I can just leave off
Fantastic.
where I'm at. I use indigenous futurisms as reclaiming the narrative, or presenting on what life would be like for indigenous peoples if first contact never happened. Indigenous futurism is an alternative timeline. I know we always point to 1492 as first contact. What if that contact never happened? Where would we be at? Would we still be living in teepees? Would we still be living in longhouses or hogans, and not seeing the colonization we're seeing today through health, careers, and certain traditions? That's how I see Indigenous Futurism in my work, presenting this as a bird's eye view of the non-natives not being here anymore, not having to go through what we call the ghost dance and wish that the non-natives would go back across the pond. None of that would have happened if Indigenous Futurism would have played out where we never had contact. The way I use it in my research is video games.
Hmm.
And a lot of interviews I've done through games about games is, how do we see games going in the future where it privileges indigenous voices, but also gives us control over the narrative? One of the really good responses from a gamer I was talking to was the fact that he said, why don't we make a lacrosse game where it privileges the Iroquois nations? Because they're the ones that the creator gave the game to. They're the ones that created lacrosse. So why can't we make a video game, esports game, and say, this is the history of lacrosse from the Iroquois point of view, and then have a team that's playable in the game that you can play with the Iroquois team that has names from that nation on there, and have the language scrolling across the screen where it shows indigenous ways of knowing and reclaims the narrative, instead of you having these other sports games where there's nothing native about it. Even if you look at certain sporting events, such as the Women's College World Series, they had 10 Native girls playing during that World Series. Why can't we have a video game where we can play those Native girls? Why can't we have Lindy Waters the third on an NBA 2K cover where we can play him as a character, and instead of playing all these superstar characters? It's about privileging those voices in video games and making sure that we have authentic representation and collaboration with tribal communities. That way we have our voice in the game instead of these early video games, WHOMP''PA, and it has a little stereotypical Indian character with a stereotypical feather and a breechcloth that does nothing true to our indigenous culture. So going forth, it's about having those characters that I can see as truly reflective of the indigenous cultures. That's what I see.
And is that in service to Native youth and adults playing the game and seeing themselves reflected in it? Or is it actually more long-term re-narrativizing like what it means to be a Native American in this context? Like I'm thinking partially through the lens of something like AI, right? Where in the future, it's probably very likely that you could have an AI video game giving you whatever you want out of it as far as who the main character is. That's probably not too far off. However, that doesn't really serve this re-narrativization work. It more just serves representation for whoever happens to be playing that game.
Yeah.
So I'm curious which one is more important, but how are you thinking about the impact?
I'm looking at long term. Right now, we're at baby steps because it's just been a few years since we had a video game where the developers reached out to the tribal communities and asked their advice and told them, can you help us put your story in the game where it truly reflects your culture? The very first one, if you look at it, going back, it's called Never Alone. And game developers reached out to Alaskan communities and had them help with the input about who the character, the storyline, and that's only been a few years ago. So when I'm looking at these video games going forth, I'm looking at long terms. What other video games can we reclaim the narrative, and instead of going back to those stereotypical images that we see in Mortal Kombat 3 with Nightwolf or Turok the Dinosaur Hunter? Why can't we move forward? And I'm gonna say this: those games I just mentioned, Mortal Kombat 3 and Turok, growing up, those are my favorite games. I didn't know at the time, and I didn't realize or even think about that. The reason I figured that out is because I had students ask me, if you look at Turok, he wears a breastplate in the game and he fights dinosaurs. I've had students ask me time and time again, Mr. Barry or Dr. Barry, do you fight dinosaurs all the time? Because that's what the game shows. Are you able to change into a coyote or a wolf? Because that's what the game shows in Mortal Kombat 3 with Nightwolf. So going forth, it's a long-term plan of mine to dismantle those stereotypes in those video games. Because if you look at the history of video games, which is less than 70 years old, there's about 30, 40 games out there that have stereotypical images of Native Americans. But going forward since about 2010, there's only about 4 or 5 or 6 games that really have indigenous character that truly represents who the culture is. No matter what culture or tribe it is, it steps toward that goal of dismantling those stereotypes in video games.
What, as a school leader, how would we reframe video games? Because I have to tell you that it was kind of frowned upon when I was growing up.
If you look at the percentages, 87% of textbooks in social studies show indigenous peoples from that pre-1900 context. And it still shows us as that savage Indian, that romanticism where we're out there, raping and killing white women. That's what the textbooks show sometimes, the pre-1900 context. But for school leaders, and I'll use a game that really helps me out in my social studies. It's called Assassin's Creed 3. And Assassin's Creed 3 has a Mohawk character. And game developers reached out to the Mohawk tribe, cultural experts, and said, hey, can you help us out? So they did that. But at the same time, students that play Assassin's Creed 3 get to experience the Revolutionary War, get to experience the aspects of that time period that, from student feedback, the game explains more about that time period than the textbooks do. So you have video games teaching students these history lessons that can apply to exams and tests well, instead of just showing a small paragraph or a 2-page topic over Revolutionary War. They're actually playing it. And because 90% of students are video gamers, you're teaching to their strengths. You're actually letting them enjoy video game and also learn history at the same time. My advice to school leaders is if you want a game or a couple games to use about history, use Assassin's Creed. I guarantee students may score higher on exams about revolutionary times than they would just learn about the textbooks. So that's what I would advise the student leaders.
This episode sponsored by Assassin's Creed 3.
Yeah, that would be nice. They made a nice chunk of change.
Yeah. What's sad though is that they make that game and it truly reflects who we are and also helps out student learning. But the next game that was going to plan to be coming out was Assassin's Creed Civil War. And it was going to teach about the Civil War. And I was all for that. I was going to have that in my classrooms because I wanted students to play it and learn about the Civil War. But it got canceled because of DEI issues. They're not going forth with that game anymore. And I wish they would have, because it would be another video game to use in the classrooms. But sadly, because of the climate we are in now, you will not see that game ever produced.
Switching up a little bit from, if we're done there with futurisms.
Yeah.
But I remember Dr. Yellowbird saying, indigenous peoples have always embraced technology.
Yeah.
And so when people think that romanticized view of indigenous people, it's often of people in the past and wondering why we use duct tape.
Yes.
Or why we're talking about video games. But switching up from that, I'm thinking you did some really interesting work on colonial schools, I think they're called. And that's a topic of Indian education that a lot of us are unaware of. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So, the titles kind of changed a little bit. I don't really use colonial schools anymore because it doesn't give the time frame. What I use now is called the Indian schools in the 13 colonies. That's kind of where I can place and people in the audience really know that's the time period I'm talking about, is the 13 colonies. I'm a descendant of the federal Indian boarding schools. My great-grandparents went to Carlisle Indian School and Chilocco Indian School and Rainy Mountain Indian School. I also taught at a contemporary Indian boarding school, Riverside Indian School in Oklahoma. A couple years ago, I was on a teacher's workshop in Virginia, and it was on the campus of William and Mary. And one of my faculty colleagues, he said, Kelly, let's take a walk. I said, okay, where are we going? He said, we're going to take a walk across campus. Well, I had no idea that campus sprawled about 3 or 4 miles. Did not know that. If you're in Virginia in the summer, it's very hot.
Hot and humid.
So my colleague took me on a walk about 15, 20 minutes across campus. And we got to this building. He said, look around. I want you to look around. I said, okay. And all these buildings look the same. I'm thinking we could have saved 15 minutes. I could have looked around at those buildings where we were at instead of going in the heat where I'm sweating, looking for some water. And he says, I want you to look at the building behind you. And I looked at it, same building I could have saw 15 minutes down the road. And I said, what's so special about this building? He said, you're looking at the oldest still standing Indian school on this continent. And I said, what do you mean the oldest Indian school? He said, this was called the Bradfordton Indian School. And it's in early 1700s. And my thinking at the time, and I asked him, what do you mean Indian school? Because I thought the only schools were the federal Indian boarding schools after 1819. He said, no. You had Indian schools that were educating native students in the 1500s, the 1600s, and 1700s. Blew my mind because the textbooks in the classrooms only talk about the federal Indian boarding schools. Many scholars out there only talk about the federal Indian era boarding schools. And I had no idea that those schools existed. There's only about 7 or 8 of them that you can name by name. And I mentioned one as the Bradfordton Indian School. And they were what I call the first formal phase of Indian education in this country, because I use the word formal. Indian people always had education, whether it's hunting and gathering, putting up teepee, gutting a buffalo, or butchering a sheep. We've always had that. But by the powers that be, our education was deemed inferior or hedonistic at times. So that's why I use the word formal, because it was white institutions. And so going forth, you look at those schools that I'm researching right now, they have the same assimilation going on through language and school subjects. But here's the thing about this difference between those schools and the federals is that a lot of the students got to keep their hair. They didn't make them cut their hair like the federal Indian boarding schools. A lot of them, they got to keep their language. And some of these tribes, some of these schools, such as Brafton, they allowed what's called proctors coming from those tribes to make sure the students were well fed, they kept their language intact, and they weren't kidnapped, because during that time period, kidnapping and slavery was really prevalent. That was unheard of in the federal Indian boarding schools, where only students were taken and nobody from that tribe was able to go with them to make sure of their well-being. So those schools set their first stage, were similar but different at the same time, as far as wearing a uniform. Sometimes, like the Brafton, it was solely just for Native boys. It wasn't a co-ed like you see at other schools. But that's what I like to tell people when I always hear a presentation. They would say, we're going to talk about the histories of boarding schools. Great. We're going to talk about all the three eras: the colonial, the federals, and what we call the self-determination schools of today. I always hear scholars talk about the federal Indian boarding schools, the second phase, which is great because those stories need to be told. But when you say histories of boarding schools, make sure you talk about all three eras. That's what I advocate.
Yeah, I would say that we have to think a lot about power, and even with the word formal, like let's say conventional or sanctioned by Eurocentric worldview. And there's only 13 colonies, so of course they're going to have to guarantee student safety because it could create a war with the surrounding nations, right?
Yep.
And what were some of the other schools during that time?
And so Harvard, everybody says, oh yeah, Harvard Indian College. At this time, some of these schools weren't called schools, they were called colleges. But they were still teaching that K through 12 curriculum about reading, writing, science, and English. But for the most part, those students stayed on campus. That's why I still refer to them as boarding schools, because they stayed on campus. But if you go back, you can name Harvard as one, Brafferton, Fort Christiana, which is in Virginia, Salmon Creek Indian School, which is in kind of relations to the Maharan tribe and East Coast. And then you have a couple others that are mentioned as schools, but not named. If you want to go back to the very first one, you go back to 1536 in Mexico. And it was a college for indigenous children in Mexico that was preparing them for service in the ministry. So 1536, which is about 40 years after the Doctrine of Discovery, you can name the first Indian school for indigenous children in the Americas. And I understand people push back and say, well, Mexico, are they really natives down there? Yeah, they are. There's natives down there. So I count that as the very first one in 1536. I'm not great at Spanish, so I can't really give it justice, but those about 5 or 6 that I've named are the ones. And then you have, which I left out, the prelude to Dartmouth University, called Moore's Charity Indian School. That was the Indian school that Wheelock started and then took those students to Dartmouth to start Dartmouth University. That school was actually co-ed for Native students. Those are about 5 or 6 schools I mentioned that are rarely talked about in classrooms, because I've heard from teachers say that I didn't know, it's not part of U.S. history. And I get that. It's pre-1776, but it may not be part of U.S. history. It's part of indigenous history. And those schools really set the foundation for the schools coming afterwards, whether they were similar or not. They were part of that first phase of teaching a white education to Native students who had no clue what was going on. They were innocent, just like the federal Indian boarding school students, and they're innocent now. We just decided to educate what they, at that time period, the motto was, we're going to educate the children of the infidels. That was the motto. If you look at the federals, it was kill the Indian, save the man. And, Richard Pratt, All he did was rehash what they were doing in the first phase. So I always tell people, don't give all the credit to Richard Pratt because he was just rehashing what they were already doing. That's my argument a lot of times in my presentations.
Infidels.
That was the motto. They called us the infidels.
Jeez.
What are the criteria or hallmarks of the current day classification of the school? You said it was a self-determination school. Like
Sure.
I feel like we've and this conversation in past ones, we've sort of outlined this distinction of the first two phases, but how would you create criteria for the modern day one?
I always point people back to about 1966.
Okay.
And so there's a school called the Rough Rock Demonstration School. And it's on the Navajo reservation. And that was the very first school that had the autonomy and were dictating their curriculum, dictating hiring practices of hiring Native faculty, which those federal Indian boarding schools and those colonial Indian schools, they didn't hire Native faculty. So this is the first time in history with these schools, Indian boarding schools, that we actually had natives teaching natives. We actually had natives being overseeing decisions in these schools. So about 1966 is when you start to see the self-determination schools show up. And today, Riverside Indian School is part of those schools of self-determination. Even though it was a federal Indian boarding school, it's now self-determination. Rough Rock Demonstration School is the very first one for Native students taught by Native teachers.
Got it.
That's interesting. Generationally, we'll send their kids to those types of schools like Riverside, Flandreau, and I don't know the names of the others.
Yeah. And, what I'm excited about is that we still have 183 Indian boarding schools or tribally controlled schools across the United States. There's always going to be issues with schools, but for the most part, my time at Riverside, these students were coming from areas, reservations that, there was high drug use, suicides, alcoholism, domestic violence, and we gave them a home. We provided 3 meals a day for them. There were times at Christmas when students didn't want to go home. And I asked them, why don't you want to go home? And they said, well, when I go home, I don't know where my next meal's coming from. I don't know if we're going to have lights at home. I don't know if my father's going to beat me when I go home. So we gave them a safe haven. And through boarding schools, even though boarding schools have that stigma of being trauma induced for our people, today's schools, it's all about families and that self-determination where we provide a safe haven for our people.
That's interesting. The whole Indian education spectrum is really complex. People like to say all boarding schools are bad, but currently there are some schools trying to combat the negative effects of colonialism or settler colonialism, and it's interesting.
Yeah. And there are families I've talked to where they didn't want to send their kids to schools like Riverside because of that stigma. I've had a grandma say, when she called me, she said, hey, Mr. Barry, do y'all still beat people there? Do y'all still cut their hair there? She went to boarding school where those things happened. She didn't send her kid there or grandchildren there, but I had to explain to her that it's far different than what you experienced. But that's where we're at now. We're not cutting people's hair. We're not making them learn religion. We're actually giving a free reign of what to learn, what to research. And the thing about Riverside and other schools is that we get to infuse indigenous ways of knowing into the curriculum. That's one of the highlights. What I like to talk about is these boarding schools of today.
I'm just thinking, my grandmother went to a boarding school, but it was in the community. Previous, she went to Catholic school, and it was really funny because in our community, each tribe has their own relationship, right? There's not one narrative for everybody, although there's shared similarities. The Catholic school was the high achieving school, so they would say, yeah, we can sure read, but then publics are having a tough time. There was definitely a competition, and some would call each other public and that closely.
That's funny. Kelly, I really appreciate that arc or that spectrum. I think that's really helpful to helping our listeners kind of ground themselves in where we are today and where we've been. I asked a question to a guest we talked to a couple months ago when we spoke with Kara Bobroff. Also listened to that episode from the NACA Schools Network. Asked her how she defined innovation within her network of native schools. I think that's a word we throw around all the time, but I don't think, especially people who are sort of saying what is a great school, have nearly a wide enough aperture for what that can mean. And you just talked about the incorporation of indigenous ways of knowing. You talked about some of these other ways, but I guess from the position where you're in now, how do you think about innovation within schools and maybe specifically within indigenous serving schools? And is that different from the Western conception of what innovation is or means?
Yeah. When people think about innovation, some people think about STEM, which is great. People do think that. But for me, innovation, if I look at these boarding schools versus a public school,
Hmm.
I think about the opportunity to offer native language courses in these classrooms. If you look at Oklahoma, not every school offers a native language. We only have 7 native languages being taught in Oklahoma, which we have 39 federally recognized tribes. So if we're going to talk about innovation, it's about having every school system, whether or not they have native students offering a native language. Less than 100 years ago, our native languages weren't allowed to be spoken in classrooms.
Hmm.
So for me, it's about getting a native language, even if it's one. Like I know some schools have 5 or 6 being taught. Where I teach, we have 5 different languages being taught for students. But in the K through 12, even if you have just one, that's making strides to show you want to honor indigenous peoples. You want to make sure indigenous students' needs are being met. One part of innovation is to add languages to school, keep adding those languages. But I understand the barriers such as finding qualified instructors to teach those languages because a lot of the tribes don't have fluent instructors. And a lot of the tribes don't have those programs that are building those instructors. My tribe, we don't have a program building instructors for Apache language teachers. So we can't offer those in the classrooms. But if you go 20 miles to the west, the Kiowa tribe, they have 7 language instructors in 8 different schools. So they're making strides on that. Also, innovation is having cultural classes. At Riverside, we had ribbon skirt making classes, we had drum making classes, we had drum etiquette classes. And so those are courses you don't see in the public schools. I think sometimes people just don't want that culture in the classroom, or they just don't understand how to bring that culture in the classroom. But it's offering courses and opportunities for our students who may not have grown up in the tribal community. And there's a bunch of those students everywhere that are kind of disconnected from the tribe, but you give them opportunity to learn who they are. And to me, that's innovation, is being creative and making sure you have culture in the classroom that wasn't seen less than 100 years ago.
Hmm. This might be an unfair question, and forgive me if it comes off wrong. That I'm trying to kind of square both this futurism piece and what you just shared, which is like, I guess, where in this definition of innovation, what you just described sounds a little bit like surviving rather than thriving. It sounds like keeping something alive from the past. There's so many reasons to do that. I think that is justified and fantastic. I'm just curious, when you're thinking about the futurism component, how do you take this thing that is the idea of survival, whether that be knowledge or practices or a culture, and really turn that corner into something that is more thriving and generative toward new futures, new traditions, new things? Is that a conversation that's had? Is that something like we're at the first phase? We just need to go slow and make sure that in order to start it all, we have to have this one piece like staying alive. How are you thinking about that as someone who's not newer in your role, but you are probably younger person within your institution who's really trying to shake things up?
Mm. So for me, I mentioned those cultural classes, but from my background and my strong points, my strong suits is technology. And earlier you mentioned AI.
Yep.
And so for me to go forward to keep that culture in the classroom with AI, it's about showing the histories of indigenous peoples, maybe in Southwest Oklahoma, about how we lived 300 years ago, because AI has been doing that. I have a colleague up in Alaska, and they have an AI program where they're showing 3,000 years ago, a Alaskan village, what it looked like 3,000 years ago with, hunting and gathering, drying the food out, building canoes. So for me, I want to show the past, of where we were, the present where we're at, and then the future about where we can go. In my term, and what I see as sci-fi, I'm a sci-fi person. So
For
how
sure.
can we go forward and show what sci-fi looks like in about 100 years with Indigenous peoples? When I present this, people ask me, so what you're talking about, are we going to be fighting predators in the future? That's one thing we could show, but it's basically just showing different viewpoints of where we can go in the future, and not just necessarily an alternative timeline, but showing us in, administrative roles that we don't have today. Show us in careers where our studies can go 100 years from now with the use of AI, and what Indigenous peoples and ceremonies and traditions may look like 100 years in the future. There's new dances coming about every day with our tribes. There's new songs. What do songs look like 100 years in the future? It's not about just surviving, but it's also about making sure these students understand, as Indigenous peoples, where we can go. We're not limited to what the classroom or what Eurocentric studies show us. We can be our own people, just like we were in the past and what we are today. And I always tell people, when people ask me, are you Indigenous? And I say, every day. Every day I'm Indigenous, because that's who I am. And I'm going to continue to be Indigenous every day. And 100 years from now, if I'm still living, I'm going to be Indigenous in 100 years. Using AI to show what we can do in the realm of possibilities with sci-fi, movies, books, songs, dances, and clothing. Because we got a lot of people that are making clothes now. So what does our clothing look like in 100 years?
Thanks for that answer. It reminds me of the Ursula Le Guin book, Coming Home. I don't know if you've ever read that, but it's a sci-fi book set in the future where the world is ended for some reason. Everybody forms tribes again. The science fiction book is a collection of fictional songs, recipes, and dances from the people that are alive. And it is like the stories we tell, the stories we keep, and these things that are some of our earliest technologies for remembering or for getting people in step together or worshiping. They are some of the most long-standing and also the most important to continue to iterate on and keep around.
And then I want to ask Jason a question on this one, because he and I are both what we call powwow people.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not a powwow person. My family, my wife dances, but not me.
Okay.
And I'm the support crew. I'm like the pit crew. Carry the stuff.
Critical role.
Yeah. So one of the questions I got asked when I was talking about what does 100 years look like for us was, what do powwows look like in 100 years? I didn't know how to answer that, Jason. So I was going to see if you got your thoughts about what do powwows look like in 100 years? Because as you know, powwows are always changing, always evolving to new dances and new dance styles and songs. So what do you see?
I think what we have now is, and I can only speak for my community, a lot of it is similar because we pride ourselves on the traditional dances. Like, so there's the crow hop, it's a crow dance. There's a crow traditional women's dance. So, and a lot of the meaning is still there, although some probably has changed a bit. The daytime dance is what we used to have, what people call the powwow now. My grandmother told me when she was little, when the men would war dance, it was fierce and scary and kids would cry. It still happens now, but I think that's changed a bit. But she said that was because those men were actually reenacting their deeds through dance. And so it was pretty fierce. Other than the breastplates, my father-in-law told me it used to be made out of buffalo ribs because it was body armor. So that's changed so far. Now it's more a display, but there's still meaning behind it. A lot of the traditional teachings are contained within those elements of the regalia. And each tribe is different. So like in my tribe, paint is inherited. You have to have inherited the right to use certain paints. And I know maybe some other tribes, maybe, for example, the fancy dance is more of like a social dance. It's, for fun. People can use the colors they want from what I understand. But then there's some traditional aspects that are inherited. You can't just look at somebody's paint and copy it. You have to have that relational responsibility and cite your sources. My granddaughter inherited a certain type of necklace from my mother, and it's passed down. Not everybody can just look at it and say, oh, that's cool, I'm going to copy one. That's like the free place market of ideas, right? Where you can just look at something and copy it. And I think just being in community, that type of stuff. So there's some songs that are entertainment purposes, and so you can sing those songs. But then when you're in community and in connection, you realize, okay, those songs you have to have permission for, or they're for certain functions. Whereas in a regular American society, if you hear a song on the radio, you can sing it all you want. You can even change up the lyrics if you want. You can do a cover. There's the element of the modern, social and entertainment wise. Then there's the sacred or the traditional. And reconnecting, I think, is very important for that reason, to understand drum etiquette, the protocols with drums. And so just different approaches to knowledges and different ways of keeping a proper relationship with your knowledge. So I don't know what they're going to look like, Kelly, but I know what they look like now versus what I've heard in the past.
Yeah.
And it's possible that they'll look the same, but the context of the present will help them find new meaning or new people. The thing itself might not be the thing that changes.
There was one little piece, like in our tribe, there's beadwork, and they use buckskin like drawstrings to tie like armbands or the leggings on and stuff. And so while I was being powwow pit crew, I was like, why don't we just use Velcro? Velcro would be so. And I did not receive a favorable response. I said, if you want to do this other type of stuff, you do it, but this is how we learned, so this is how we're going to continue.
That's funny.
If I was there, Jason, I probably would have said, on your own time, Jason.
Make your own outfit. You can do what you want.
That is funny.
Even within designs, within my tribe, certain families will have certain designs. And of course, there's makers that can make stuff. But in the area of indigenous knowledge, with regard to respect, reciprocity, relationality, all those R's, it's pretty strong.
Yeah. And then, Mason, what Jason's talking about is, actually, I use it as a teaching and learning moments in my classrooms, because a lot of people just assume. I got asked a question a couple weeks ago from a student. He asked me, Dr. Berry, do all Native Americans speak Native American? And that was the question I got. I said, no, we don't speak Native American. We speak our own specific tribal languages. And I told them that there's 574 federally recognized tribes in this country. Many more in Canada, many state recognized tribes. And we're all distinct in our languages, our traditions, our ceremonies. So it was a teaching moment where he knows now that there's no such thing as speaking Native American. There is a such thing as speaking Crow, Apache, Kiowa, and Choctaw. When we talk about powwows, that's another teaching moment that I do. I send my students to powwows. Sometimes I have to bribe them with bonus points. I all want bonus points. So I'll send them, and then they'll do reflections. Then come back knowing that we all have different regalia. We don't call it costumes, because that's what some of my students really said in the classroom is, what kind of costume do y'all wear? That's a no-no. So now they use regalia. And those teach and learn moments have provided a foundation for my students learning about indigenous ways of knowing. I'm glad we talked about the powwows and, and this distinctness of it, because it reminded me of my teaching and learning moments in classrooms.
That's great. Thank you, Kelly. All right. I think we need to start to bring this to a close. Jason, do you have any closing questions for Kelly or any gratitudes you want to express?
No, I don't, but thanks for joining us today. That was interesting and intriguing, just that 1776 and the schools that happened before that date, as well as the other indigenous school in what is now known as Mexico, but it is North America. So that was fascinating. To think about the currents of that ideology that still takes place in all of our schools on our continent, especially towards indigenous communities, is thought-provoking. So thanks for sharing all that.
Yeah.
Thanks for sticking with us, Kelly. It's been great to chat with you today, and it's lovely to meet you. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, and I appreciate the time. And, Mason, going forward, and Jason knows this, that if you ever catch a presentation of mine about boarding schools, it won't be in the federals, it won't be in the self-determination, it'll be in those 13 colonies context.
That's good to know. All right. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about.
Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.